Hello and welcome to a special interview for The Wire. At a moment of economic crisis, has the country been given the budget it needs, or has the finance minister made a terrible mistake? And secondly, is the budget based on credible figures or just unjustified assumptions? Those are two of the key issues I shall raise today with former Chief Economic Advisor and former Chairman of Kotak Mahindra Bank, Shankar Acharya. Professor Acharya, let me start with a couple of general questions to ascertain your overall view of the budget before I come to specific issues. The Indian economy seems to be in dire straits, if not a crisis. Have we got the budget we need at this moment?
Okay, Karan. My summary assessment would be that probably not, that it doesn't do enough. But having said that, I would also go on to say that the kind of very difficult economic situation we are in, it's not the role of one single budget to counter that. It is much more the whole train of economic and financial policy over time. You know, if you look back at our last 30 years history, let's say, a single budget rarely swings things one way or the other, with the possible exception of 1991, when there was a change in paradigm. You know, Manmohan Singh's famous budget. Otherwise, it's, in a way, expectations are too high of all budgets.
In that case, let me ask you whether this budget has a clear direction and whether you believe that's the right one, or whether it tries to do so many different things that it ends up being directionless.
I think it doesn't have, in that sense, a clear economic framework and direction. I don't think several of the budgets of the last few years have had that either. Given that this very difficult economic situation we're in, you know, lowest growth in 10 years, highest unemployment, etc., in 40 years or whatever, and all sorts of other bad things going on in the economy, one would have liked, you know, in fact, let me put it this way, it's striking that the budget doesn't start by recognizing the problem more clearly. You know, the kind of things we're talking about, that growth has slowed sharply, that unemployment is higher, that, you know, general theme, youth unemployment particularly, is higher, that exports have stagnated, financial sector is still in serious stress, and a number of other things we could go on. It doesn't say all of that. You know, it would be, I think, better had the budget said this in the first few paragraphs and say, look, these are real problems. It's going to be challenging for us to handle them. I, as finance minister, am going to make a start in this budget. I've already in the past year done some things, refer back to some, whether the corporate income tax or so forth. We need to do more, that sort of thing.
Are you therefore also saying that because the budget doesn't clearly, unequivocally accept both the fact there is a problem and the size and scale of that problem, it therefore can't really get around to addressing it adequately either? You can't address what you haven't accepted and defined.
I mean, outside the budget, the finance minister seems to have made a fair amount of statements where, you know, she's clearly recognized there's a serious problem. And going back to, let's say, September, 6 months ago.
But not on the floor of the House on budget day.
Exactly. And that, I think, it's, in my view, a shortcoming.
Let me ask you now about specifics. Everyone seems to agree that the key need is to boost growth, which could this year have fallen even below 5%. And people say this could either be done by boosting consumer demand or by stressing on infrastructure and investment. And although the finance minister has clearly cut income tax rates for those who want to avail of the new regime, and that will help boost consumption, her stress really is on pushing investment. So let me ask you, do you think she's done enough? And what sort of results do you think she'll get?
On investment, I don't see a big pickup because of the budget. There may be some cyclical upturn, one doesn't know. Because the nature of cyclical things is they go down, they go back up. But I don't think there's anything in the budget which, to my mind, does something concrete to raise investment at the aggregate level in the economy. I just want to say one other thing about, Karan, about your putting it as consumption, investment. I would bung in exports as not only for good old balance of payments reasons, but as a source of demand, because it's coming out, it's out there. It's our policies.
Has she done enough in this budget to boost exports, which, by the way, have been either stagnating or shrinking for a good 6-7 years?
I think regrettably not. In fact, in that area, I would go so far as to say I'm very disappointed, because one of the things you don't do if you want to improve exports is to raise customs tariffs.
And she's done that.
And she's done it again.
Let's come back to investment,
Yeah.
because most people believe that is the principal thrust, her principal strategy for boosting growth.
Right.
Now, at the very center of her investment strategy is infrastructure. She's spoken of how the government wants to spend over 100 lakh crore in the next 4 years. And no doubt this year itself, she's boosted government capex by 18%. But the surprising thing is the actual allocation for infrastructure is just 12,500 crore. What do you make of that?
Right. I'm very bad at remembering numbers in the budget, so you probably have them before you. I think in terms of percentage of GDP, as I recall, correct me if I'm wrong, that the capital spending in the budget itself is about something like in the order of 2% of GDP. If you include also the IEBR, what's budgetary support and what investment is done by public sector enterprises, central public, I think it rises to 4.5% of GDP. And presumably there's some going on in the States, so maybe 5-6% of GDP. But the increase as such is, I think, if you take investment being done directly by the budget, capital expenditure, or through central public enterprise, it's still a fairly low number.
Which is why you believe you're not going to have a major impact in terms of investment and in terms of growth as a result.
Well, that's part of it. The other is really, the bulk of investment in the economy is being done by private agents, companies, other private entities.
And they are not ready to invest at the moment.
They don't seem, so far whatever data we have don't seem to be showing an upturn in investment activity.
And to what extent do you believe private investment is restrained by the fact, A, that they can't see a demand and therefore there's no need to invest, because who's going to invest if there's no demand? And secondly, many companies have actually surplus capacity of up to 30%, which they need to first exhaust before they start investing.
I think both those are relevant. I would also point to a third factor, which is that our credit system is still under enormous stress if you take banks and non-banks together.
So was the finance minister right in stressing an investment strategy as the route to boost growth, rather than perhaps concentrate more on consumption and put money into the pockets of people who readily spend it, thus creating demand, which would give an incentive to companies and businessmen to invest?
Well, I'm not sure what you're referring to as finance minister's strategy to boost public investment. I would say it's relatively normal what she's done. You increase capital.
Nothing special in what she's done.
In terms of capital outlays and so on? Well, compared to the rest of the budget, yes, that is I think it's 15% increase or something like that. 18%, yeah, which is good. I'm glad.
But it's not that. Necessarily what's needed.
If you take it along with the IEBR, which is also sort of, then together, I'm not sure that the increases of that order.
So at a time when she believes that in fact the stress on investment is the answer to the low growth, you're actually saying to me, it's not such an important stress that she's put. 18% is pretty close to what we should see normally, not a response to a crisis year.
You have to also remember we had a bad year in terms of what investment was done last year. In a sense, you're doing catch up. 18% would be good if last year was also say 12, 15%, whatever. You were on a rising trend, but that's not the way it has been.
So in fact, in terms of what was needed, this stress on investment as a way of boosting growth is not sufficient. It's not what we need at the moment. We need more.
Yes, but you're fiscally constrained.
Let me put up something else to you. She's also hoping that she can encourage foreign investment in infrastructure by giving concessions to sovereign wealth funds and by increasing the limits to which FPIs or NRIs can invest in corporate bonds or government securities. Do you think that this is sufficient to bring a sizable amount of foreign investment into infrastructure in the next 12 months?
Very hard to tell. Sufficient? Not at all, since our needs are huge compared to what can
But
bring.
will it have an appreciable impact?
It could have. I just don't know. I mean, the
So
reason.
it's a bit of a leap in the dark.
Yes, but I mean, it's probably worth trying. I mean, there are some downsides about, are you becoming too dependent on borrowed foreign capital and that sort of issue, the same sort of issues that were raised with sovereign bond, in the idea.
Which he didn't go ahead with.
Exactly.
But you're saying a very interesting thing. You're saying these steps to encourage foreign investment in infrastructure are worth trying. We don't know what sort of outcome they'll have, but clearly at a time of crisis, when you want to take steps that are more certain to produce results, this is not necessarily one such step.
Well,
it's worth trying, but it's no guarantee.
There's no guarantee because, I mean, really, foreign investment, in my view, will not leap in if domestic private investment is not going in a big way.
And that's not happening.
That doesn't seem to be happening.
And the sort of demand push that would have made it easier for foreign investment to follow domestic investment, that too hasn't happened. There's one other promising thing in this budget for investment. That is the commitment the government has made to create a taxpayers' charter enshrined in law, which will address this concern of tax terrorism. And she's also given a more or less certain guarantee that she will decriminalize civil offences. Now, this is something that people have wanted. It should have happened earlier. But again, will it change the investment climate to such an extent that it will boost investment in the next 12 months? Or is it just one of those things that needs to be done?
I think both of those are very desirable. Of course, it will be in the fine print of the taxpayer charter and so on as to what those rights are. But I think both of those moves in the right direction. I warmly welcome them. And I would not just say it's all about investment at all. I think there are a lot of people who are not investors. They're just people who pay taxes. And for them also, something like a taxpayers' charter, which gets enshrined in the law and is meaningful, would, I think, be very, very welcome.
Well, once again, you're coming to a very interesting conclusion. This is a desirable step. It's a needed step. It's one that should have been taken a lot earlier. But when the finance minister presents it, as she's been doing at her press conferences, as something that will actually encourage and boost investment, you're saying that's not necessarily going to follow. It creates a good environment, but it won't, of its own, boost investment once again.
But it could. It could help.
It could help.
Yeah.
So
one shouldn't be negative on all this.
We're talking about two measures,
Yeah.
which at best could help, but they're no guarantee of increased investment. One of them is the encouragement to foreign investors, sovereign funds in particular. The second is the taxpayers' charter.
Yeah. I think, Karan, we should step back a bit, if I may. I know you may have an agenda, but let me step back a bit. I think it's important to appreciate, and I don't know whether the government appreciates this, that when you're in a declining growth trajectory, I mean, it's still growing, but at lower and lower rates, the economy, it's not something, there's not an easy switch that you can, kind of flip and say, okay, that's over, now we're going to. It's much more complex. You have to act across them. And that's where issues of, an overall economic framework, if not vision, at least an idea of where exactly one wants to go, this needs to be bought into across the government.
And this is where her failure to clearly define and accept the extent of the problem actually becomes an obstacle to tackling it. Because if you define it clearly, you know what needs to be done, or you have a better idea. If you don't, then you're slightly blindfolding yourself.
Well, you don't impart a sense of confidence to all those who are hearing you when you read out a speech. Because, you don't seem to have recognized the gravity of the problem that we're in.
We've reached a very interesting stage that the finance minister is relying primarily on investment to boost growth. She's done a few interesting things. They could help. None of them, however, are more guarantees that investment will go up. Nonetheless, the finance minister believes she's done enough to actually project 10% nominal growth next year, which presumably means she's talking about something like 6 or 6.5% real GDP growth. Now, given that in the year that's ending, nominal growth was just 7.5%, and real growth could even fall below 5%, is this projection for next year credible?
Well, I mean, it's not. I think it's. I wouldn't put it in the incredible range. I would say it's possible. I mean, but possibly from not the growth side, but a little more inflation. As you know, the retail headline inflation is already above 7%. Of course, that's because of certain agricultural commodities and so forth. But it's quite possible that in the coming year, you have inflation not at 4, but closer to 5, 5.5. I mean, remember the range.
But this is again a very interesting interpretation. If that projection of 10% nominal growth, which suggests 6 or 6.5% real growth, is really only possible because of what happens to inflation. And if inflation stays where it is at the moment, it's just over 7%. We're talking about actually growth shrinking to 4% or even 3.5%.
Yeah, I mean, whether growth, real growth, is going to be 5, 5.5, 4.5, 6, you know, all I'm saying is that's only one part of the equation. The other is inflation.
Absolutely.
And so taking both into account, I mean, if I were sitting in the finance ministry, I would also be quite comfortable with 10% nominal.
Yes, but this is again very interesting. Most people, when they looked at that figure of 10% nominal growth, said, this is exaggerated, we can't achieve it. But you're saying actually, what the finance minister may have borne in mind is that inflation will stay high and might even marginally grow, and that makes 10% possible, not because growth is high, but because inflation is high.
Right.
This, of course, leads directly to my wanting to ask you about the government's revenue projections. Now, on the basis of 10% nominal growth next year, the budget is projecting gross tax revenues to grow by 12%. And when you break that down, it means that GST has to grow by 12.8% compared to 5.8% this year. Corporate tax by 11.5% compared to minus 8% this year. And income tax at 14%. You're a former chief economic advisor. Do you think those are realistic projections?
Those kinds of things have been achieved in the past. So I would not rule them out. They're certainly optimistic. It's particularly optimistic in the context of the previous year, where the tax buoyancy taken as a whole was about 0.5.
And she's projecting a tax buoyancy of 1.2.
Yeah, but that's where, you know, the issue of, you know, whether you have 7% nominal growth in GDP or 10% does make a big difference. If there's real growth going on, it's likely to, you know, all these things can count.
You're being very careful, if not kind, in the language you use. You're saying this is possible. A lot of things that are possible may not be likely. Is it likely?
It's on the optimistic side.
It's on the optimistic side. Does that also suggest that it's not really likely in the present circumstances?
Well, optimistic suggests that it's, not exactly a 50-50. Let me interject one other thing though here, because I think if you step back and look at the fiscal deficit, you know, of the government, because that's often usually taken as a measure of how much the budget is expansionary. You know, if you have a balanced budget, it's one thing. If you have a 3% or 5%, you know, the government sector is pumping in money, net, right? Net of taxes and other current receipts. That's what a fiscal deficit is. And that number, contrary to what a lot of commentators have said, they've said, no, we haven't had fiscal stimulus. I would argue, in fact, it's pretty high. It's already, the shown deficit is 3.8%, right?
That's for this year.
For this year.
Next year is 3.5.
We'll come to that. This year 3.8, right? She has, I think, done a very good thing in becoming more transparent and also adding the table of off-budget expenditures out of borrowings. They're all liabilities, so they're part of debt, and that's why they should be there. About 0.8, I think, % of GDP.
The new figure goes from 3.5 for next year to 4.36.
No, it's like this. I think if you take the current year about to end, it is 4.6. That is 3.8 plus 0.8.
And next year's 4.36.
Yeah, 4.4, let's say. So it's 4.6 and 4.4, okay? So that is both are expansionary, highly expansionary. Now we can have a separate argument of whether it's fiscally responsible or not. That's a different point. But they're both expansionary.
So what's the point you're making?
The point I'm making is those who've been asking for fiscal stimulus from the government
have got it in this.
Have got it.
But that leads me to this other question.
And I want to put in another bit for you. people have forgotten that our accounting of things like disinvestment and so on is almost unique compared to the rest of the world. Normally, when you sell government assets, right, asset sales, whether privatization or just asset sales, normally those are taken below the line. That is, they're seen as part of the financing of the deficit. Here, we are allowed, since kind of agreement that we came to at the time of the IMF loan in 91, we are allowed to take it above the line as like a current receipt, like taxation almost. And that tends to, not just tends, it reduces the fiscal deficit. So if you did our accounting properly, okay, properly in the sense how the rest of the world does it, we would have a substantially larger deficit, particularly in the coming year.
One more thing about the deficit, and then I'll come back
Okay.
to another problem. But this deficit figure, whether it's 3.5 for next year or 4.36 when you take into account the off-budget items which he's revealed for the first time, is still not the full deficit because the government is not accounting for what are called its unpaid dues.
Absolutely.
And Pranav Sen has pointed out to me that the unpaid dues could range anywhere between 3 lakh crore and 5 and 6 lakh crore. That would add hugely because that's simply money the government isn't paying. It may be holding up economic development in the country, but it's also making the government's expenditure look much lower than it actually should be.
That's why I warmly welcome the Finance Commission, the 15th Finance Commission's report, which calls for new fiscal legislation to essentially have uniform accounting standards
Right across the government.
right across not just central government, state governments and other public sector entities.
What are the chances this government or any government will accept that? Because that's like putting handcuffs on your own hands. You can't fiddle around the way they've been doing. What are the chances this government will accept that advice?
I welcome the advice and I hope it will happen.
But let me now go back, because we were talking before we came to the fiscal deficit about the improbability or the probability or the unlikelihood of the government's revenue projections, which you said were optimistic. You said there's less than a 50% chance of them reached. And that suggests to me that the government's budget critically depends upon realizing the disinvestment target of 2.1 lakh crore. Now the problem is, in the year ending, the disinvestment target was 1.05 lakh crore, and so far we've only achieved 18,000 crore, although the government hopes that by the 31st of March it will be 65,000. Is it realistic next year to believe that you can 3 times and more better the 65,000 figure?
It's again an optimistic thing, but basically it hinges on 3 or 4 privatizations. So I think the finance minister has clearly said in interviews and so on that I've heard that the groundwork has mostly been done for Air India, Concor, I think.
And BPCL.
And BPCL. And maybe one other, I can't remember. And so if that is correct, and I assume it is, then there's a good chance that something near that figure will be realized. Now, obviously, it will depend on prices.
Those 3 were going to lead to a total of 1.05 lakh crore last year. So even if they're ready for disinvestment this year, I presume they'll bring us that 1 lakh. There's still another 1 lakh to meet, and that 1 lakh critically depends on LIC and IDBI. Now the problem is, you can't disinvest LIC until you amend the LIC Act, and the Finance Secretary said that could take a whole year. Secondly,
why should amending an act take a whole year?
Well, he was there on the front page of the Business
I
Standard
think
yesterday
possibly
saying,
he was saying, I don't know what he exactly said. I thought I read it slightly differently, but you may remember it correctly. I thought he said, look, it's much more for getting various preparatory stuff done.
I'm going to quote him from memory.
Yeah.
He says it definitely cannot be done in 6 months. It's probably going to take a year.
Okay.
But on top of that, the LIC also has to be brought online with SEBI regulations and governance norms. Now, isn't there a danger that all of this could take a lot longer than the government thinks, and the LIC privatization as a result might not happen in time for the deadline, which is March 31, 2021?
Right.
In which
That's
case
possible.
the government's in terrible trouble.
Well, all those who want fiscal stimulus will have it next year.
There's one more concern about the LIC disinvestment.
Yeah.
When disinvestment looks likely, investors are going to want to look very closely at the quality of LIC assets.
That's a very good thing because it will bring transparency to the balance sheet of the LIC.
But is there a danger that it might actually put some people off? Because the LIC has large investment in government security, both central and state government. More importantly, the LIC has a sizable exposure both to equity and debt paper
Yeah.
from what are basically default rated companies.
Yeah.
And by some estimates, the LIC is sitting upon perhaps as much as 30,000 or 35,000 crore of NPAs.
Yeah, I've seen those figures, but you have to remember that the actual balance sheet of the LIC is far, far larger than that. It's into 3 trillion or more than that. I've forgotten the number.
So these are not going to be concerns when people
No, they're
think
concerns.
about investing.
They're valid concerns. But compared to, I mean, the scale of LIC is huge. So I think, if 5 or 10% of the thing is dodgy, it will obviously lower the price compared to
What the government hopes for.
what it might
But it
otherwise
won't
have
put
been.
investors off.
Well, I mean, lower the price is one way of saying, we won't give you
But the
as good a
question I'm
price.
driving it is this: given the sort of problems we're talking about with regard to this massive 2.1 lakh disinvestment target, do you think the budget figures could go terribly awry?
I don't know about terribly wrong, but they could be undershot, of course. I mean, when you have a high target like that,
Which means the
which is
fiscal
dependent
deficit
on-
shoots up.
which is dependent on 4 or 5 major transactions, ultimately. That's what it boils down to, of which 3 or 4 may be far down the road and doable. But one large one is, as you say,
It's
further
questionable.
down. It's questionable in terms of the timing. Next year's figure obviously will be challenged. But again, on these transaction kind of things, I would point out that even if it doesn't happen by the end of next financial year, if it happens towards the first half of the next one, the money still comes in.
You just end up the year with a higher fiscal deficit.
Yeah.
Are you worried that that could put off or concern rating agencies, and that in turn could affect the percentage interest rate at which India borrows?
I think my general position is that we are better off running lower fiscal deficits because for all sorts of reasons, including the ones you mentioned, a high fiscal deficit in the global context we are in makes you more vulnerable to uncertain events. And from that point of view, for those who, there are a lot of people who say, so what, just run a higher fiscal deficit. It's just, and then we'll get more growth, the whole thing will start again, the engine. I'm more cautious.
Let's now, at this point, Professor Acharya, come to one or two areas where the budget either has nothing to say or what it said is inadequate. And I'll start with public sector banks. There's no provision for recapitalization. Beyond IDBI, the budget doesn't identify any other public sector bank to be disinvested or privatized, and there's nothing about giving greater autonomy or independence to management. Given the problem our public sector banks seem to be caught in, is this a mistake?
Well, I think you have to remember that in the last 3 years, I believe we put in already about 3 trillion or something like that, a large number of, we meaning the government of India.
So you can't carry on.
You can't, this can't be carried on. And in the meantime also, the public sector banks, most of them, have, to a large extent, not wholly, cleaned up their balance sheets in terms of doing recoveries where possible or recognizing them through provisions which are set off against profits in their profit and loss account. So it's not where we were in 2015 when this whole asset quality review program of the RBI was initiated.
Well, this is very interesting because several commentators on the budget have said that the absence to tackle more forcefully and effectively either public sector bank debt or to ensure that they are privatized at one extreme end, or at least their independence granted to their management. You're not so concerned about that criticism. You think actually the government is taking steps?
No. All I'm saying is that a lot has been done in terms of the limited point on capitalization. You raised that as a point. And this is not, it was never envisaged that this would be forever. On the harder thing of how to make PSU banks behave differently than they did up to 5 years ago, that's been a much more knottier problem throughout the history
And it
of
doesn't
public
have to
sector banks.
necessarily be tackled in the budget, But do you see any
But
signs
it's still
that
a
this
huge,
government...
it's a huge priority
And do
still.
you see any signs this government is tackling it?
Well, it's not just a problem of the government. It has surely a lot to do with the management of these enterprises
But
as
surely
well.
the direction to tackle the thrust will have to come
No.
from the government.
Agreed. And I think they have at different points made clear statements that they want to do something differently. What those things are at this point, I'm not sure what is really in train. I'm not knowledgeable enough. But there will always be a question mark on whether the future will be different from the past.
And you're now saying that there's a sense in which the ball is with the management of the banks. They need to also begin to change and alter to the directions that the government is sending them.
Well, I think it's one package, government and the government banks. You're quite right to point out that they're not in two different.
Let me bring up something else with you. At a time when the economy is...
You have to also remember that over time, because of the stresses on the public sector banks, what's been happening is that private bank lending at the margin is taking on greater shares. So what used to be a 70-30 kind of thing,
is becoming 60-40.
yeah, is getting closer to 60-40.
Which means that the relevance of public sector banks to our economy and to credit is shrinking.
Relatively. It's still dominant. It's still the dominant share, and that's why we need to worry about it.
Now, a second concern is that at a time when the economy is perceived to be in crisis, the budget doesn't tackle the issue of structural reforms, particularly in land and labour. Is that a mistake, or would you say it's not a real problem because the government could tackle these issues at any time, not necessarily in the budget?
That's one view, that if the government had the appetite, it could do it at any time. But this is where I am, how shall I say, not very hopeful about resurrecting growth in the near-term future if in the major policy document of the government, these things are just not mentioned.
So this is a major minus.
Well, I would regard, it's a minus of most budget speeches. If you look at last...
but at a time of
I think
crisis...
if you have to go back to, for example, probably something like 99 or 2000, when you had a statement on, not on land and labour, but on the public sector banks going below 50%. That was by Yashwant Sinha, you recall, by the NDA government. But it didn't get acted on. At a time of relative crisis like we are in now on the economic front, I think it becomes much more difficult to do things which politically difficult, even though they may be more desirable to give a signal, but they become politically difficult.
Normally, I thought when the economy is in crisis, actually you get the political room to take tough decisions. You're saying the opposite.
No, I'm not saying the opposite. I think they become, they're difficult always, politically. If you have not recognized in your own speech, for example, that there's a very big problem out there in the economy,
you won't take these steps.
Then it is hard to...
But this is again leading back to a point you made earlier.
Yeah.
The failure to clearly recognize the extent of the problem and to express it in public has actually perhaps one reason why she hasn't been able in the budget to say anything about the structural reforms of land and labour that are needed. Had she recognized the problem, she might have had the gumption to address this issue. But if you haven't recognized the problem, you lack the confidence to talk about these issues.
Possibly, but you also know the history of these things. Take the land one. The present government, in its previous term, started with trying to do something.
And failed because it didn't have a majority in the Rajya Sabha. Now it does. It could do it if it wanted to.
It could from the vote counting point of view, the votes in the legislature, but I think in the meantime it's changed direction. It now is much more, I think...
But that's equally interesting. A reform that would be critical at the moment to structurally correct what's wrong in the economy is politically possible because it's got the numbers in the Rajya Sabha, but the government's changed direction. Just when you need the government to have stood by its viewpoint of 2014-15, it's actually jettisoned that thinking, and we as a result are going to suffer.
Well, everybody, I think, is going to suffer in the sense that the economy will grow slower if you don't do major reforms. But a reform which has been tried and hasn't got through gets harder to do.
Except now it's got the numbers to push it through. And no one from their allies would have objected. But the problem now is not that the government lacks the political gumption, it's got it. It's just changed its economic thinking. And that's the big problem. No longer is it committed to reforms.
Yeah. And that's what
when we need reforms, the government has given up its commitment to reforms.
I think it's fair to say that the kind of reforms that was expected of the government back in 2014, I think people have stopped expecting them.
But the problem is that in this moment of crisis, we need them. And just when we need them, the government is no longer committed to them. It's changed its commitment just when there's a need for that commitment to be fulfilled.
I don't know that it's changed it just now. It's changed,
over the years,
it changed it 3-4 years ago.
It doesn't matter. The point is that just when we need that old commitment to be fulfilled, that old commitment doesn't exist.
Yeah, fair enough.
Thirdly, the finance minister has committed herself to doubling farmers' incomes by 2022. Now, Ashok Gulati, writing in the Indian Express, says that this means that agriculture has to grow at 15% a year for the next 3 years. In fact, the truth is it's been growing at roughly 3% a year right through the 6 years of the Modi government. Doesn't that mean doubling farmers' income in 3 years' time is simply impossible?
Yes, it's out of the question.
So why do you think she made this ridiculous statement? And it's not just her. Arun Jaitley's made it earlier. The Prime Minister's made it several times. This government keeps making these statements. They're clearly ridiculous. Doesn't it suggest that they're not economically au fait with the necessary details to justify this statement?
I suppose if one wants to take a charitable view, one would say that they regard putting high targets as somehow aspirational and driving policy. But unfortunately, policy doesn't work like that, because the follow-through of what you need to achieve that, if it is at all possible, and in agriculture going in 5 years, doubling is Indian agriculture, not, in my view, not just Ashok Gulati's, simply not feasible, it doesn't work.
In which case, is it just aspirational to set this high target, or is it actually foolish? Because it's foolish to claim you will do something which is absolutely impossible for you to do, and to keep repeating you'll do it and make it even worse for yourself. So is this aspirational or is it foolish?
Judgment call.
But what's your call?
It doesn't seem the right way to go for me.
Once again, you're being euphemistic. The government also, or this budget rather, reveals a fairly protectionist import substituting streak. You mentioned it earlier. Some 20 odd items have had their tariffs raised, and these range from walnuts and toys at one end to electronic appliances and footwear at the other. The government's defense is that it stepped in to protect Indian entrepreneurs from dumping. But even someone like Arvind Panagria, who this very government appointed as vice chairman of Niti Aayog, has strongly criticized this. How much of a mistake is this protectionist streak?
I think this, to my mind, if you asked me to pick one thing in the budget which I was particularly upset by, if you like, as an economist's point of view, I would pick this. Because to my mind, it's not just this budget. The government since 2014 has, in my count, presented 8 different budgets over a period of 6 years, because we are the beginning of a one. So that's normally you'd get 7, and then you had an interim budget by Mr. Goyal. In the first 4 presented by Arun Jaitley, you essentially had a continuity, that the old mantra of we should keep gradually reducing our customs tariffs to East Asian levels. Then starting in February of 2018 with Mr. Jaitley's last budget, I think you had a very regrettable turnaround or turn back towards raising customs tariffs.
And that's continued.
And that's continued in the next 3 budgets, namely the interim budget by Mr. Goyal, current finance minister's July budget, and her most recent budget. So 4 out of the 8 budgets presented, and the most recent 4, have, in my view, somewhat decisively turned back the clock on our foreign trade policy.
Isn't there a contradiction between this protectionist import substituting tendency that seems to be accelerating and the fact that, on the other hand, here's a finance minister who wants to open the doors to foreign investment in whatever way she can? She may not have taken terribly decisive steps, but she's clearly indicating that's the direction she wants to go, at the same time as raising tariffs and barriers on imports. Isn't there a contradiction there?
There is a contradiction. You're sort of inviting foreign investment to serve the domestic market, but you're not making it attractive for the foreign investment to come in and really be a platform for making you an export power.
Which would help your growth hugely.
Hugely.
Which is why you mentioned exports as a key way of boosting growth.
Absolutely.
Which she's ignored completely.
Well, I don't know about ignored completely. I hope she hasn't, because there is one para about global value chains and network products and so on in there.
Which echoes something in the economic survey.
And she had something similar in her July budget too. But what has been done on customs tariffs, as well as not just customs tariffs, what worries me is various paras on the need to scrutinize imports under FTA and so on and so forth, which essentially suggest more bureaucratic obstruction to all kinds of imports coming in.
Even the paragraph you mentioned about being part of global chains reads more like rhetoric, because you can't see what is the follow-up action she intends to take. Yeah. So it's more an assertion or an intent rather than a plan of action.
I'm afraid so, and that's why I think this is really where
Which is why I said what she's done to boost exports as a way of boosting growth is minimal, or as I put it, perhaps exaggeratedly, nothing very much.
Absolutely.
Finally, at a time when there is growing concern about unemployment, the Center for Monitoring the Indian Economy says it's roughly 7.2% at the moment. Youth unemployment is an astonishing 31%. The Finance Minister, in her speech, and I think I'm quoting paragraph 40, says, youth are no longer job seekers. They've become job creators. Does that suggest to you, as it does to Mahesh Vyas, that in fact she's denying youth unemployment? That the very 31% who are unemployed, she actually sees not as job seekers, she sees them as job creators.
Yeah, I'm not sure what her advice is on this, so I wouldn't want to comment. But I think it certainly suggests some lack of fundamental understanding of what's going on in our labor markets. That, as you know, the last governmental survey was for 2017-18, and that clearly showed one of the worst employment situations that we've ever had in the last 50 years. Not just people focus on this unemployment 6%, it's gone up from 2 to 6%. Or youth unemployment has gone up from 6% to 18%. But participation rates, people of the working age group, have dropped drastically, especially female participation, but as a whole. And as a result, now, not today, but 2 years ago, before the sharpest growth slowdown, it was already less than half the working age people, marginally below half, were either working or looking for jobs. And to my mind, that's even more worrying. So I think the view that we have a lot of people who are not employed but somehow entrepreneurs waiting to hire people, I don't know where it comes from.
In fact, if you add to that category of people who are not employed and not looking for employment, the category of people who aren't even in training, you're actually hitting a total figure which has been estimated variously between 70 and 100 million.
Yeah.
And that is very worrying, because these are people who have simply so disillusioned and so discouraged they've cut themselves off.
Well, that's why you get a low participation rate.
And as you said, when the finance minister turns around in her budget speech and refers to unemployed youth hitting 31% according to CMIE as jobs creators, not job seekers, this reflects a lack of fundamental understanding of what's happening in the labor market.
Well, let me put it this way, I wouldn't say those things.
Those were your words.
No, I wouldn't say...
What the finance minister said. Quite right. You stick by your word. This reveals a lack of fundamental understanding, which is disastrous at a time when you have very high unemployment. To have a finance minister who presents a budget that doesn't seem to understand the problem is really very distressing.
Well, I went back to right in the beginning saying that it would have been much better if in the beginning she said, look, we have a growth problem, we have an unemployment problem, we have an export problem, etc. And then say, however, these are going to be very difficult times, but my budget is going to address them by doing extra.
You've made that point 3 times, Professor Acharya. It does seem that this failure to start her budget speech
Yeah.
by defining and unequivocally stating what the problem is and its extent really is the principal problem with this budget. Everything else flows from that. If you don't recognize the problem, you're not going to have the remedies, you're not going to have the conviction and the courage to follow through with tough action.
I can only speculate, and this is a speculation, that I can't believe that she doesn't know the nature of that there are these problems.
She won't admit it.
That she feels that putting them in a budget document is somehow discouraging animal spirits or something like that. But I would take a different view, which is you recognize them because other people see them, and it's not.
This is a form of denial.
It is a form of denial. It is a form of not putting it in. I'm sure she knows these problems are there.
Then let me put this to you. We've discussed this budget exhaustively.
Yeah.
You've said at the very beginning that it's not really the budget the situation required. You said again at the very beginning it lacks a clear sense of direction. And we've discussed many of the details of the budget. And there are things that you said we could try, but there's no certainty they'll produce the right result. And we have no idea what's going to happen to the disinvestment target on which the government's revenue projections, and therefore its investment strategy depends. So look down the road. What will the Indian economy be like at the end of this financial year, March 2021?
This is where I'm a little more agnostic, perhaps you'll say optimistic. I don't think that there is a one-to-one connection between a budget presentation and how the economy performs in the ensuing year, because that is much more to do with what's already in place and already going on, whether done in the previous 6 months, whether because of global events or whatever it is. So it's quite possible that you will see, instead of growing at this year's 4.5%, 5%, whatever we get at the end of the year, that next year you might easily get 5%, 5.5%. What I can reasonably confidently suggest is that without strong action foretold in the budget, you will not get back to the sort of 7% plus path.
But this is interesting. You're suggesting in that answer that budgets don't matter as much as we, the Indian people.
In the short run.
In the short run.
And
that's why a bad budget or a disappointing budget may not be such a critical hit to the economy.
Right.
But a good budget would actually give a boost.
Yes. And I just want to go back to what I said, that it's not one budget that's important. It's the series, which is why the series of 4 budgets which have turned anti-foreign trade, anti-exports, anti-imports,
is a very bad
is, to
indication.
my mind, the most worrisome part of this budget. The other ones, one can have two views.
But you're concluding by saying, even though this is in many senses a disappointing budget, India could still end up growing at 5%, 5.5% because of everything else that's happening.
Yeah.
And this is a bit like what they used to say in the old days, India grows at night when the government is asleep.
Could be.
Professor Acharya, a pleasure talking to you.
Thank you.
To receive instant updates on all videos from The Wire, click the subscribe button and hit the bell icon. Pay to support independent journalism. Click the link in the description and choose the amount you want to pay.